The cold air stung the noses of the German engineers as they stood around the newly captured M4 Sherman tank. It had been dragged from the battlefield just days before, intact, though scorched, like a beast torn from hell itself. The tank sat in the middle of a large concrete hangar in Bavaria, surrounded by curious eyes and clipboards. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Weber, a respected engineer with the Waffenamt, was leading the analysis. For weeks, rumors had spread across German lines that the Allies' Sherman tanks were not only arriving in massive numbers, but were performing with strange levels of consistency. Soldiers swore that even when one was destroyed, two more took its place, almost like the machines were bred, not built. Weber wasn't a superstitious man, but he believed in one thing above all. Machines had logic, and logic could always be uncovered. "Strip it," he ordered, his voice echoing through the building. The tank was still smeared with blood and smoke stains, but that didn't matter to the engineers. They moved like surgeons around a body, removing the side armor, examining the gun, the turret ring, and the powertrain. The first impression was underwhelming. "It's simple," muttered Erich, Weber's assistant. "Very simple design. Not like our Tigers or Panthers," Weber nodded. That was exactly what made it so dangerous. Inside the engine compartment, the team found a gasoline-powered Ford GAA V8. It was nothing impressive. Loud, hot, vulnerable to fire. The Germans had long mocked the Sherman's tendency to catch fire when hit. They called it the Tommy Cooker, as if it were an oven for British troops. But then they noticed something odd. As they dismantled the turret drive, they found a power traverse system powered by hydraulics, not gears, smooth, responsive. The turret turned faster than anything they'd built. That meant the Sherman could fire quicker, reposition quicker, react faster in a fight. Their tanks, while superior in armor and guns, were slower in rotation. "That's interesting," said Weber, noting it carefully. But it still didn't explain the tank's strange reputation. 3 days passed. The Sherman had been picked clean. The Germans even tried to recreate some of its mechanisms, building a partial mock-up of the turret ring and drive. But something was still bothering Weber. Every part of the tank looked mass-produced. It was cheap steel, stamped parts, rivets where German tanks used welded plates. The optics were good, but not better than the German ones. The armor wasn't particularly thick, and yet it worked. On March 22nd, an SS officer arrived with an intelligence folder. He threw it onto Weber's desk and walked out without saying a word. Inside was a map, some photos, and a list of names. They were American tank factories, hundreds of them. Weber flipped through the photos, his eyes slowly widening. Assembly lines, thousands of workers, rows of tanks, hundreds in one photo alone. Women in overalls tightening bolts, men guiding parts down conveyor belts. Black workers, white workers, side by side. He had never seen anything like it. And suddenly, he understood. The secret of the Sherman wasn't in its steel. It wasn't in its gun or armor. It wasn't hidden in any part at all. It was in the system that built it. The tank wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of something terrifying to the German war machine: industrial democracy. A nation that had turned its factories into war machines without losing its humanity. He sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The engineers had copied the Sherman, but they could never copy the soul of it. "Make the report," he said quietly to Erich. "But tell them, they won't like what we found." Weber lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. He'd just finished writing the official report, full of technical jargon that would please the brass. Details on the Sherman's gun elevation speed, the engine's simplicity, and the unusual use of sloped armor. But none of that was what haunted him. What haunted him was what he didn't write. He knew the report would end up on some general's desk, skimmed and discarded with a scoff. The arrogance of the Nazi war machine didn't leave much room for reflection. They would say what they always said. American engineering is crude. Their tanks are weak. Their soldiers are soft. But soft men didn't build 50,000 tanks. Later that night, under the low yellow lights of the hangar, Eric returned with a strange expression. He carried a dusty olive-green metal box. "We found this inside a storage panel under the gunner's seat," he said, placing it on the table. Weber opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten letters. American letters. Soldiers writing home, some in broken English, some full of slang Weber couldn't understand. One letter caught his eye. It was written in pencil, smudged from sweat or tears. "Hey, Mama, don't worry about me. The boys here are solid. My loader's a Jewish kid from Brooklyn. My driver's a farm boy from Iowa, and the gunner's a black fella who can shoot the tail off a gnat. We don't care what color each other is. In this tank, we're just Americans." Weber read the letter 3 times. This was the part no German engineer could copy. A tank crew that fought not just with training, but with belief. The Sherman wasn't just steel and oil. It was trust. Trust between men who came from different worlds, but shared a single purpose. In the Third Reich, such a thing was impossible. Jews were being slaughtered. Black people were subhuman in Nazi doctrine. To imagine a black man commanding a gun and being respected by his white crewmates was heresy. But in that letter, it was normal, ordinary, real. Suddenly, the Sherman wasn't just a machine to Weber. It was a message. "Sir," Eric said quietly, breaking the silence, "why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" Weber looked up. He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the rest of the box. Beneath the letters was a photo, faded, curled at the corners. 4 young men in uniform, standing in front of their tank, smiling. One of them black, one wearing a Star of David necklace, one with a cigarette hanging from his lips. The fourth, probably the one who wrote the letter. Behind them, scrawled in white paint across the Sherman's armor, were the words, "Liberty rolls." Weber felt something twist in his gut. He had spent his career believing in the superiority of German engineering, precision, complexity, tradition. But what he saw now was a kind of strength he didn't know how to quantify. This tank, crude as it was, wasn't just rolling into villages. It was rolling into history. The next morning, Weber requested a private train to Berlin to deliver his findings directly. Not just the official technical report, but the letters, the photos, the truth. He knew many would laugh, maybe even accuse him of defeatism, but he no longer cared. Because the real secret of the Sherman wasn't about mechanics, it was about meaning, and Germany had nothing like it. The train rattled along the tracks through a gray morning fog, pulling Weber deeper into the heart of Berlin, and further from everything he once believed. He sat alone in a small compartment, the photo and letters inside a leather folder on his lap. Outside, the countryside flashed by in streaks of war fatigue, burnt fields, abandoned farms, and soldiers marching silently down frozen roads. Germany was crumbling, and for the first time, Weber could see it, not just in the cities, but in the hearts of its people. Inside the capital, the atmosphere was electric with fear and desperation. The Allied bombing raids had grown heavier, and word of Soviet advances on the Eastern Front spread like a sickness. Still, the High Command moved like they were invincible. Weber arrived at the Waffenamt headquarters in the late afternoon and was summoned into a meeting with General Major Kurt Reinhardt, an arrogant man with polished boots and a permanent smirk. Weber laid the folder on the polished table and opened it. "Another captured Sherman, I presume?" Reinhardt asked. "Bored already?" "Yes," Weber said, choosing his words carefully. But this one was different. He began with the technical aspects, speed of turret rotation, the simplicity of the parts, the modular design that allowed field repairs within hours, not days. The general nodded, uninterested. But then Weber slid the letter forward. Reinhardt picked it up and began to read, his brow slowly furrowing. "What is this? Sentimental nonsense?" "It's more than that, sir," Weber said. "This is what we're missing. Not just efficiency, not just numbers, belief. These men trust each other. They fight for one another, even if they're different. Jews, blacks, Christians, farmers, mechanics. They're all Americans in that tank." Reinhardt scoffed, tossing the letter onto the table like it was garbage. "You're telling me this rust bucket's secret weapon is diversity?" He sneered. "What next? Poetry and artillery shells?" "It's unity, sir," Weber replied, his voice low but firm. "They've built a war machine on the back of freedom, and it's working." The room went quiet. Reinhardt stood slowly, walked to the window, and clasped his hands behind his back. "I suggest you remember your place, Oberstleutnant," he said coldly. "You're an engineer, not a philosopher. Your job is to tell us how to build better tanks, not praise our enemies." Weber felt heat rising in his chest. "With all due respect, sir, we can't build a better tank if we don't understand why theirs works so well." Reinhardt turned, eyes hard. "Then copy it, improve it, strip away their sentimental filth, and make it German. We don't need their ideals. We need their results." Weber clenched his jaw. He knew this would happen. He knew they'd ignore the truth in favor of pride. He gathered the letters, stood, and saluted. "As you wish, Herr General." As he left the building, a strange feeling settled over him. Not anger, not fear, clarity. They would copy the Sherman, maybe even build something close. But they would never understand what truly made it powerful, because the Sherman wasn't just a tool of war. It was the result of a system that embraced the very thing the Reich rejected: humanity. And that was the one thing Germany could never replicate. Back in his quarters that evening, Weber lit another cigarette and stared at the fading photo of the crew once more. 4 boys smiling in front of a tank. 4 enemies in the eyes of his government. And yet, those boys were winning the war. Weber didn't return to the testing facility in Bavaria. Orders came through the next day. He had been reassigned to a secret tank research program in Austria. No explanation. No farewell. Just a sealed envelope and an SS escort waiting outside his flat. He suspected the real reason was the report, the honesty of it. Someone up the chain didn't like his tone. Maybe it was Reinhardt. Maybe it was someone worse. The new facility was buried in the Alps, hidden behind thick pine forests, and patrolled like a prison. Officially, it was designated Werk 47, a place where the Reich's superweapons were meant to be born. Unofficially, it was where ideas that didn't belong in the daylight were buried under steel and silence. Inside, Weber found himself working alongside a small group of scientists and engineers on a project called Eberstahl, a tank meant to rival the Sherman in speed, numbers, and ease of production. On paper, it was a dream. 25 tons, sloped armor, a turret traverse speed twice that of the Panther, and most importantly, easy to build. But in reality, it was a disaster. The steel was scarce. The welders were undertrained, and the factories? Bombed weekly by Allied air raids. Worst of all, the project was being overseen by an SS officer named Hauptsturmführer Kruger, a true believer. Cold eyes, sharp tongue. A man who saw the world through one lens: pure blood, pure power. Kruger didn't care about engineering. He cared about image. "Make it elegant," he barked during one of the meetings. "Make it something that shows the Reich's superiority. We don't copy Americans. We outclass them." Weber said nothing. But inside, he knew the truth. They couldn't afford elegance anymore, not with what the Americans were doing. By April, rumors began to spread from the front lines. In Normandy, in Italy, even in North Africa, soldiers were reporting things no German command wanted to hear. Shermans moving like swarms, dozens appearing where there had only been one. Wounded tanks repaired in hours. Crews swapping parts like they were toys. One message hit Weber harder than the others. Enemy armor overwhelming. Not in quality, in confidence. They don't fight like they're afraid. They fight like they've already won. It was that line, in confidence, that stayed with him, because confidence couldn't be forged in steel. It came from something deeper. One night, while alone in the workshop, Weber heard the echo of boots behind him. He turned to find Kruger standing there, holding a folder. "Berlin intercepted more letters," Kruger said with a sneer. "Your American friends have been writing again." He tossed them onto the table. Letters taken from dead Sherman crews. Weber hesitated, then opened one. "Dear Emma, this war's hell, but the guys in my crew make it bearable. Joe talks about jazz all day. Tommy's fixing a broken radio with gum. We're scared, sure, but we believe we're on the right side. That helps. That really helps," Kruger scoffed. "They're weak, full of dreams and softness. We will crush them." Weber looked up, voice low. "They're not soft. They're free. And that's why they'll beat us." For a moment, Kruger didn't move. His smile disappeared. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. That night, Weber didn't sleep. He sat in the cold silence of the hangar, staring at the beginnings of the Eberstahl prototype, wires hanging loose, armor plates still unbolted. He thought of the Sherman, of the photo, of 4 boys who believed in each other more than in the machine they drove. And for the first time, Weber realized something terrifying. This war wasn't about tanks anymore. It was about systems, about souls. And one side had built both better. Rain hammered the tin roof of Werk 47 like gunfire. Weber stood at the edge of the test field, soaked to the bone, watching a crane lower the turret onto the chassis of the half-finished Eberstahl prototype. The machine looked menacing. Sharp lines, angled armor, the kind of shape that screamed power. But Weber didn't feel pride. He felt dread. Behind him, Kruger lit a cigarette, his black SS coat beading with water. "Look at it," he said smugly. "It makes the Sherman look like a toy. This is what fear looks like." Weber kept his mouth shut. He knew what fear looked like. He'd seen it in the eyes of German soldiers retreating from the front. He'd seen it in the silence of bombed-out villages. And now he saw it in the Reich itself, desperate to create something it could no longer afford, both in material and in morale. Later that night, Weber returned to his quarters. He opened the desk drawer, pulled out the faded photo of the American crew, and stared at their smiling faces again. Then, slowly, he reached for a blank sheet of paper and began writing. Not a report, not a schematic, but something he hadn't dared to do in years. A letter. "To whoever finds this, you will hear many things about German engineering. About our brilliance, our precision, our machines. But none of that matters anymore. Because what we never understood, what we refuse to see, is that machines are only as strong as the people inside them. The Americans don't win because their tanks are perfect. They win because they believe in each other. Because they build machines to serve men. Not the other way around. I have spent my life building weapons for a nation that sees people as tools. And now, I see where that road leads. We lost the war long before the first Sherman reached Europe. We lost it when we decided that purity mattered more than unity, that fear was better than trust, that men like those in this photo were enemies, not examples. Forgive me. He folded the letter and tucked it behind the photo. The next morning, an explosion shook the compound. A test of the prototype's main gun had failed, catastrophically. A misaligned breech, a cracked recoil system. 2 engineers were killed instantly. Kruger blamed sabotage. Weber blamed arrogance. Over the next week, morale collapsed. Workers stopped showing up. Supplies were delayed. One of the welders, a Czech prisoner, whispered to Weber during a break, "You know it's over, don't you?" Weber nodded. He knew. But Kruger didn't. He ordered the prototype to be rushed, no matter the risk. "The Führer wants results," he barked. "We show them this tank and they'll remember what German fear looks like." On April 12th, the Eberstahl was loaded onto a transport train bound for Berlin. It never arrived. American bombers, tipped off by resistance spies, struck the train yard outside Salzburg. The explosion was seen for miles. No survivors, no prototype. When the news reached Werk 47, Kruger went pale. For the first time, he didn't speak. Weber watched him from across the compound, a man who had built his career on fear, now fearing everything. That night, Weber packed a satchel. Inside it, he placed only 3 things: the photo, the letter, and the original turret diagram from the Sherman. He didn't know where he would go. Maybe Switzerland. Maybe surrender to the Allies. He just knew one thing. He was done building weapons for ghosts. As he stepped into the darkness outside the compound, he looked back one last time at the facility that had promised to build the future of German armor. It hadn't built the future. It had buried the past. And all it left behind was silence. Weber moved quietly through the wooded edges of southern Germany, careful to avoid roads, patrols, and the ears of anyone loyal to the Reich. Every step away from Werk 47 felt like breathing again after years underwater. He didn't walk like a man on the run. He walked like a man in mourning, not just for lives lost, but for a country that had strangled its own future with pride and hatred. His destination was vague. He'd heard whispers from prisoners, factory workers, even disillusioned officers. Go south. There are Americans near the Swiss border. Some listen before they shoot. By the 4th day, his boots were cracked and bleeding. He hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. The rain hadn't stopped since he left. But he kept going, clutching the satchel tight against his chest. Inside was the truth no German general wanted, and perhaps no American would understand. The Sherman's real advantage wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the mind of every man who believed in the cause behind it. On April 21st, Weber finally reached a ridge where the forest broke and gave way to open fields. In the far distance, he saw what he had been hoping and fearing to find: a column of Sherman tanks. They were rolling slow and cautious, supported by infantry, American flags stitched to sleeves. The thunder of their treads was rhythmic, heavy, confident. He dropped to his knees, not from exhaustion, though it clung to every limb, but from realization. He had spent years designing machines to fight these very tanks. And now, here they were, his only hope for salvation. Weber took a piece of torn white cloth, tied it to a stick, and walked toward the field with both hands raised. At first, nothing happened. Then he heard a sharp whistle. The tanks stopped. A few soldiers knelt into firing position. One man, an officer it seemed, stepped forward cautiously. "Halt! Hände hoch!" The command was in German, but it came with an American accent. Weber obeyed instantly. "I'm not armed," he shouted in English. "I'm not your enemy. Not anymore." They searched him. took his satchel, found the documents, the letter, the photo. The black sergeant who examined the letter looked at Weber suspiciously. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. "It was inside a tank," Weber said softly. "Your tank. Your men, they made me realize what we could never build. They didn't kill him. They didn't even strike him. They listened. He was blindfolded, taken into custody, and driven to a small American forward base where intelligence officers questioned him for hours, not just about the Eberstahl, but about factory networks, supply chains, tank development, names of engineers and officers. But the most time was spent on the contents of that letter, the one from the American soldier to his mother. Weber told them what he saw, the way those men worked together, the way they moved, the way they trusted each other, not because they were the same, but because they believed in the same thing. "Your Sherman," he said quietly, "was not just a machine. It was a promise, one we never understood." When the session ended, one American officer walked him outside, handed him a tin cup of weak coffee, and said, "You're not the first Nazi engineer to realize they were on the wrong side. But you're the first one who said it like this." Weber didn't reply. He simply looked out over the camp, soldiers laughing, sharing rations, a black mechanic helping a white tanker fix a tread, a Jewish chaplain talking freely with a Protestant sergeant. He watched them, and for the first time in years, he smiled, because they weren't just defeating Germany's tanks. They were defeating its very idea of superiority. The Americans moved Weber to a more secure base further south, near a small village recently liberated from German control. The barracks were modest, the food simple, but everything felt human. No shouting, no officers parading around in leather coats demanding fear. Just soldiers doing what soldiers do. Fixing tanks, sharing cigarettes, listening to music on static-filled radios. Weber was still under watch, of course. An enemy asset, as they called him. But the tone changed. They no longer looked at him like a spy. They looked at him like a man with answers. A young American lieutenant named Charles Henderson took the most interest in him. Tall, sharp eyes, carried himself like someone born to command, but without arrogance. He visited every day, asking questions, not just about tanks, but about ideas. "Why do you really leave?" he asked one afternoon, sitting across from Weber in the makeshift mess hall. Weber hesitated. Then he pulled the faded photo from his satchel, the one the Americans had already copied twice, and placed it on the table between them. "I didn't leave because we were losing," Weber said. "I left because I realized we deserved to lose." He pointed to the black crewman in the picture. "In my country, that man is not even considered human. In yours, he commands a gun that can tear through a Tiger tank. That's not just a difference in ideology. That's a difference in destiny." Henderson leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "And yet we still get told we're the ones lacking discipline. That our tanks are weak, that our army is just a chaotic mess of whoever showed up." Weber smiled faintly. "Yes, and that chaotic mess is what terrified us. Because when a Jewish boy, a farmhand, and a black man can fight together in a steel coffin and call each other brother, what weapon can defeat that?" Silence hung between them. Later that evening, Henderson brought Weber to a Sherman tank parked at the edge of the base. "This one made it through 5 battles," he said. "It's patched up with parts from 3 others. 2 of the crew were killed in France. The rest keep going. You want to know why?" Weber nodded. Henderson tapped his chest. "Because they believe, not in orders, not in flags, in each other." That night, Weber couldn't sleep. The sounds of distant artillery were soft thunder in the background. But his mind was louder. He had once believed in German precision, in control, in superiority. He now saw that faith in one another was more powerful than any calculation. The next morning, he made a request. "I want to speak to your tank crews," he told Henderson. "I want to tell them what they've done. Not just to the Reich's machines, but to one of its makers. It was a strange request, suspicious, but Henderson, after a long pause, agreed. And so that afternoon, under the open sky and surrounded by rows of Shermans lined up for maintenance, a former Nazi engineer stood before a group of tired, grease-stained American tankers. He told them what he saw, what he learned, how their machine was more than steel and fire, how the letters they left behind changed the mind of a man raised in hatred, how the way they lived, even in war, was what made the Sherman more terrifying to the Reich than any gun. By the end, no one clapped. No one needed to, because they all understood something unspoken. They hadn't just broken a tank engineer. They had freed him. The war raged on, but for Friedrich Weber, the war inside him had already ended. By now, his presence at the American base had become a quiet curiosity. Soldiers nodded at him when he passed. A few even shared their rations. Some still didn't trust him, and rightly so, but most had heard what he said that day beside the line of Shermans, and it lingered with them. In a nearby tent, a tank crew cleaned mud from their boots while reading the translation of the letter he had carried from the beginning. One of the black mechanics, Private Miller, folded the letter carefully and said, "I wish that guy knew what his words did." Weber did know. That letter had shattered something inside him, something heavy and false. It made him realize that he'd spent years designing death machines for a cause that wanted to erase the very kind of men who'd written it. In the following days, American command sent a report back to Washington. German engineer turned, possibly useful for post-war intelligence. Appears sincere. Technical knowledge confirmed. No signs of sabotage. But the paper didn't capture the truth. The truth was, Friedrich Weber had been reprogrammed, not by propaganda or threats, but by something far more dangerous to tyranny: empathy. A week later, a visiting American general arrived at the base. After reviewing Weber's reports and diagrams, he invited him to a classified meeting with Allied engineers. They showed him what was next: newer tanks, faster production lines, plans for air superiority, the kind of military strategy the Germans could only dream of, because the Reich had choked itself on complexity, paranoia, and hierarchy. Meanwhile, the Americans had learned to build not just tanks, but momentum. As the meeting ended, the general pulled Weber aside and asked, "Do you think your people will ever understand what we figured out?" Weber looked down for a moment, then met the general's eyes. "No," he said quietly, "because they still think the war is being fought with machines. But you've already won it, with ideas." Before Weber could return to his bunk, a soldier intercepted him. A fresh telegram. The message was short. Werk 47 destroyed. All staff presumed dead. No survivors. Weber's hands went still. Kruger, the engineers, even Erich, his assistant, the one man who had started to see the truth in quiet silence. Gone. Wiped from existence like a failed experiment. The Reich wasn't collapsing. It was devouring itself. He folded the telegram and placed it into the satchel with the rest. That night, as darkness fell over the base, Weber walked once more to the Sherman that had survived 5 battles. The one that sparked his doubt, then his belief. He placed the photo of the original crew inside its turret, tucked neatly behind the seat where the gunner would sit. Then he whispered the only words that mattered now. Danke. Not for the machine, for the men, for what they had unknowingly done, for showing him that a tank wasn't the reason the Allies would win. It was the people inside. It, the young, loud, brave, flawed, free men who drove it forward through fire and steel and death, not for conquest or ideology, but for each other. As the engines of nearby Shermans roared to life, moving out into the night, Weber stood still, watching their silhouettes vanish into the black. He didn't belong among them, but somehow, in a strange, invisible way, he did. Because even a man who once built machines for evil could be transformed by the souls who drove them.